The gates of Bergen-Belsen were already open when the British arrived. That detail would later matter more than anyone expected. There was no dramatic moment of liberation, no final clash, no guards fleeing under fire. The camp had collapsed inward days earlier. Disease, starvation, chaos, doing what bullets no longer needed to. When the armored vehicles stopped outside the perimeter on April 15, 1945, the barbed wire still stood, but authority did not. What remained was a place that had outlived its purpose and had not yet learned how to die. The soldiers expected noise. They expected shouting, crying, running. They had seen photographs. They had heard rumors from other units. They knew they were about to enter something that would follow them for the rest of their lives. But still, they expected movement, a human reaction to survival. Instead, they were met with stillness. Thousands of people were inside the camp, tens of thousands by some counts. But the ground did not surge toward the gates. No crowd pressed forward. No hands reached out. From a distance, it looked as though the camp itself was empty, abandoned, quiet, strangely inert. Only when the soldiers moved closer did they begin to see the figures. Bodies lay everywhere. Some were dead. Many were not. People lay on the ground, on wooden bunks, on bare earth, too thin to resemble what the soldiers understood as human form. Skin stretched tightly over bone, faces sunken beyond expression, eyes open, unfocused, watching nothing. A British officer stepped through the gate and stopped. The smell hit first. Rot, excrement, decay layered over sickness. It was a smell that erased the distinction between the living and the dead. The officer later wrote that it felt as though the camp itself was decomposing. Not just the bodies, but the idea of order, of time, of normal human progression. A translator raised his voice. "You are free now," he said. The words hung in the air, waiting for a response. None came. Some prisoners looked up. Some did not move at all. A few turned their heads slightly, as if reacting to sound rather than meaning. No one stood. No one approached the gate. No one asked questions. The soldiers exchanged glances. Someone repeated the sentence, louder this time. "You are free. The camp is liberated." Still nothing. One man near the fence began to laugh. It was not relief. It was not joy. It was a dry, broken sound, repeating itself until it dissolved into coughing. Another prisoner covered his ears. A woman on a bunk pulled a rag over her face and turned toward the wall. The soldiers had come prepared to fight. They had come prepared to rescue. What they were not prepared for was refusal. Not spoken yet, but already present in the air, heavy and unmovable. Medical units followed quickly behind the first troops. They began triage immediately, moving through the camp with a sense of urgency that bordered on panic. Typhus was rampant, dysentery, tuberculosis, starvation beyond anything most of them had seen. Entire barracks were filled with people too weak to lift their heads, let alone walk. The initial assumption was simple. They could not leave because they physically could not. That explanation held, at first. But as days passed and emergency care stabilized some of the survivors, a new pattern emerged. Some prisoners regained enough strength to sit upright, to eat, to speak. Some could walk short distances with help. And yet, when British officers began organizing evacuation, when transport trucks arrived, when doctors explained that people would be moved out of the camp, something unexpected happened. A number of prisoners refused. Not confusion, not misunderstanding, refusal. They shook their heads. They pulled back. Some clutched their blankets or the wooden frames of their bunks. A few became agitated, their heart rate spiking, breathing turning shallow, bodies locking in place as if under attack. When told they would be taken somewhere safer, they asked one question again and again. Where? The answers did not help. Outside the camp, Germany was a ruin. Cities burned, villages erased, roads filled with refugees, soldiers, the displaced, and the dying. For many in Bergen-Belsen, there was no home to return to. Entire families had vanished into mass graves, gas chambers, forced marches. Countries had expelled them long before the war ended. Borders no longer meant safety, only uncertainty. But fear alone did not explain everything. Doctors began documenting behaviors they could not easily classify. Prisoners who could walk refused to cross the perimeter. People who had been abused for years reacted with terror to the absence of guards. Some asked when roll call would begin. Others waited for orders that never came. A British medical officer wrote that several survivors appeared incapable of initiative. They could respond to direct commands, sit, eat, stand, but froze when asked to choose. Choice itself had become the threat. Inside the camp, life had been reduced to survival within rigid, brutal rules. Every moment had been dictated. When to wake, when to stand, when to eat, when to sleep, when to die. The system was monstrous, but it was consistent. Outside the gates, nothing was defined. Freedom arrived without instructions. For some, that was unbearable. One nurse recorded an exchange with a middle-aged man who had survived multiple camps. When told he would be transferred to a nearby hospital, he looked at her calmly and said, "I don't know how to live there." When asked what he meant, he gestured around him. "I know how to live here." This was not loyalty. It was not gratitude. It was not submission to the ideology that had imprisoned him. It was something more disturbing, a psychological adaptation so complete that removal from the environment felt like a new form of violence. The camp, in its final days, became a paradox. It was no longer a prison, yet it still contained prisoners. The gates stood open, yet many remained inside. The British did not force them out. They hesitated, partly out of compassion, partly out of uncertainty, and partly because the medical reality was undeniable. Forcing severely traumatized, malnourished individuals into an unstable outside world risked killing them faster than leaving them where they were. So, Bergen-Belsen remained. It changed, officially. The SS was gone. British military administration took over. Medical tents replaced guard towers. Food distribution replaced punishment. But the physical space stayed the same. The barracks, the fences, the ground soaked with memory. And within that space were people who had survived the machinery of extermination, only to be caught in its psychological aftermath. Freedom had arrived too late for some parts of them. In the weeks that followed, reports would be written, terms would be coined, patterns would be studied. But in April 1945, none of that existed yet. There was only a camp that had stopped functioning as intended, and a group of people who did not know how to exist without it. Standing at the gate, British soldiers realized something unsettling. Liberation was not a single moment. For some, it was a process. For others, it was a shock. And for a few, it was a door they could not bring themselves to walk through. The war had ended. But for those who asked to stay, something else had already ended, long before the gates opened. Liberation did not shut Bergen-Belsen down. It exposed it. In the days following April 15th, the camp did not empty. It did not dissolve into motion. Instead, it hardened into something new, a place suspended between what it had been and what no one yet knew how to create. British command initially assumed that Bergen-Belsen would be cleared quickly, that the survivors, once fed and treated, would leave, that the camp itself would be dismantled, erased, burned if necessary. That normal logic would reassert itself once the SS were gone. None of that happened. The first obstacle was physical. Tens of thousands of prisoners were too weak to move. Starvation had hollowed them out beyond immediate repair. Typhus spread unchecked, claiming lives daily, even after liberation. Doctors worked around the clock, setting up emergency hospitals inside the perimeter because moving patients was more dangerous than leaving them where they lay. But as the immediate medical crisis stabilized, a deeper problem surfaced. one that had nothing to do with broken bodies. People stayed. They stayed in barracks that still smelled of death. They slept on the same wooden platforms where others had died days earlier. They lined up for food at the same spots where roll calls had once decided who lived another day. Even when transport was available, even when told they could go, a significant number of survivors did not move toward the exit. Instead, they clustered inward. British officers noted how groups formed instinctively around familiar structures, specific barracks, specific sections of the camp, even specific corners of the yard. Survivors who had been strangers weeks earlier now refused to separate. When told they would be transferred individually, many resisted. Some became visibly distressed. A few broke down completely. Medical staff began documenting reactions that did not fit the expected narrative of rescue. People who had endured years of brutality did not celebrate safety. They did not ask about the future. They did not speak of plans. When questioned, many gave the same answer in different words. I don't know. Not confusion. Not ignorance. A genuine inability to project themselves beyond the present moment. One British psychiatrist described it as a collapse of temporal awareness. The future, the very concept of it, had ceased to exist for many prisoners long before liberation. Survival had been reduced to the next hour, the next command, the next ration. Anything beyond that horizon was meaningless. Outside the camp, the world demanded decisions. Inside, none were required. The camp administration changed rapidly. British military governance replaced SS authority. Guard towers were repurposed or abandoned. The language of orders shifted from threats to instructions. Food distribution became systematic. Medical protocols replaced punishment routines. But the physical environment remained largely intact, and that mattered. Survivors navigated Bergen-Belsen by memory rather than sight. They knew where not to step, which paths were safe, where rations would appear, which sounds meant danger, and which could be ignored. The camp, for all its horror, was a known system. The outside world was not. When British officers explained evacuation plans, they spoke in generalities. Hospitals, rehabilitation centers, displaced person camps. For the survivors, these words meant nothing. They had learned painfully that vague promises often preceded catastrophe. Some asked specific questions. Will there be food? Yes. How much? The officers could not answer. Will there be guards? No. That answer, meant to reassure, often had the opposite effect. Without guards, who controlled the night? Without rules, who prevented chaos? Without punishment, what enforced order? Years of captivity had rewired basic assumptions about safety. Violence was expected. Arbitrary authority was normal. Predictability, even in cruelty, felt safer than freedom without structure. British medical teams began noticing a pattern. Survivors responded better to strict schedules, fixed meal times, clearly announced routines, even rules. When order was imposed, gently, humanely, anxiety levels dropped. When given open choices, anxiety spiked. This was not submission to the camp. It was survival behavior carried too far to be switched off instantly. One nurse recorded that several patients became agitated when told they could eat whenever they wanted. Accustomed to rationing and punishment, they interpreted abundance as a trick or a test. Some refused food unless instructed to eat. Others hoarded bread under their bedding, unable to trust that more would come. Doctors struggled with terminology. There was no established language for what they were witnessing. These were not cases of simple shock, nor were they classic trauma responses as understood at the time. Something deeper had been altered. Decision-making itself appeared damaged. People asked permission for trivial actions, to stand, to sit, to move to another bunk. When told permission was unnecessary, they froze. A few asked repeatedly, as if the answer might change. Others waited silently, refusing to act without confirmation. In one report, a British officer described a group of survivors standing motionless in the rain, staring at a cleared gate. When asked why they were not leaving, one man answered quietly, "No one told us to go." This was not sarcasm. The camp had trained obedience into the body, reflexively, mechanically. Over time, obedience had replaced initiative. Without external commands, internal motion stalled. Bergen-Belsen thus became an unintentional experiment in psychological aftermath. It was not a place of freedom yet, but it was no longer a prison either. It existed in a liminal state, a space where survival habits collided with liberation realities. British authorities faced a dilemma they had not anticipated. Forcing people to leave risked physical and psychological collapse. Leaving them indefinitely in the same environment risked entrenching the very damage liberation was meant to heal. There was no manual for this. Medical staff debated quietly among themselves. Some argued for rapid relocation, a clean break from the site of trauma. Others insisted that sudden displacement would be catastrophic. Evidence mounted quickly in favor of caution. Patients transferred too early often deteriorated. Panic attacks, refusal to eat, severe disorientation. Some begged to be returned to the camp, not because they loved it, but because it was the only place their minds could still map. The phrase "home" appeared in reports, cautiously, uneasily. Bergen-Belsen was never described as home by the survivors themselves, but their behavior betrayed an uncomfortable truth. It was the last environment they understood. For many, the war had erased every other reference point. Families were gone, towns destroyed, national identities stripped or rendered dangerous. Liberation did not restore what had been taken. It merely removed the immediate threat of death. What remained was emptiness. Inside the camp, emptiness had rules. Outside, it did not. The British response evolved out of necessity. Instead of immediate evacuation, they began transforming the camp into a transitional space. Rehabilitation programs were introduced. Basic autonomy was encouraged gradually, not abruptly. Survivors were given tasks, not forced labor, but structured activity. Structure mattered. Those who participated showed signs of improvement. Those who were pushed too quickly into unstructured freedom often regressed. It became clear that liberation was not an event. It was a process, and for some, a dangerous one. The camp that had once existed to erase individuality now had to be used, paradoxically, to help restore it. But time was not neutral. The longer survivors remained within the familiar boundaries, the harder it became to imagine life beyond them. Every day inside reinforced the known over the unknown. British doctors noted growing resistance among some individuals, not to authority, but to change itself. These were the people who would later be remembered as the ones who asked to stay, not because they loved the camp, but because the alternative felt like falling into nothing. Bergen-Belsen did not end when the gates opened. It lingered, inside the minds of those who survived it, shaping their fears, their hesitations, their silence. The camp was gone as a system of terror, but its order remained, and breaking that order would take far longer than anyone expected. The first refusals did not come as protests. They were quiet. No shouting, no arguments, no barricades at the gates. When British officers began organizing the first evacuations from Bergen-Belsen, the reaction they encountered was not resistance in the traditional sense. It was something subtler and far more unsettling. People simply did not move. The initial lists were straightforward. Those strong enough to travel would be transferred to hospitals outside the camp. Others would follow later. Medical logic dictated urgency, cleaner facilities, better sanitation, a chance to isolate typhus outbreaks. On paper, it was mercy. In practice, it triggered fear. When names were called, some survivors looked up blankly. Others shook their heads. A few whispered to one another. When orderlies approached with stretchers or offered arms for support, several patients pulled away sharply, their reactions immediate and visceral. "No," one man said, barely audible. At first, the word was dismissed as exhaustion, as confusion, as shock. British staff had been warned to expect disorientation. They repeated instructions more slowly. They reassured. They promised food, beds, care. The refusals continued. One nurse recorded that a woman clung to the wooden post of her bunk so tightly her knuckles bled. Another patient curled inward, knees drawn to chest, rocking slightly, as if trying to disappear. When asked why they did not want to leave, the answers, when they came at all, were fractured, incomplete. "I can't." "Not yet." "Here is safer, safer." The word appeared again and again in reports, each time more troubling than the last. From an external perspective, Bergen-Belsen was the definition of danger. Disease, corpses, unsanitary conditions, psychological devastation. But safety, as the survivors experienced it, was not a matter of environment. It was a matter of predictability. Inside the camp, terror had rules. Outside, nothing did. British officers struggled to reconcile this contradiction. Some interpreted the refusals as stubbornness, others as ingratitude. A few, those who spent longer inside the camp, began to understand that something else was happening entirely. Freedom had arrived without translation. For years, every significant action in a prisoner's life had required permission. Stand, sit, eat, move, sleep, speak. Silence was enforced. Choice was punished. Initiative could be fatal. This was not simply conditioning. It was survival logic refined under constant threat. When liberation removed that framework overnight, it did not restore autonomy. It erased the last remaining structure holding people together. Doctors began noticing physiological reactions tied specifically to the idea of leaving. Heart rate spiked when evacuation was mentioned. Breathing became shallow. Hands trembled. Some patients experienced dissociative episodes, staring through people, losing awareness of their surroundings entirely. One British psychiatrist wrote that the word outside alone was enough to trigger panic in certain individuals. Outside meant exposure. Outside meant vulnerability. Outside meant decision-making without protection. The camp, horrific as it was, had reduced life to a narrow set of rules. Those rules were cruel, but they were known. In their absence, the mind searched desperately for substitutes. In one documented case, a survivor agreed to leave only after being given a detailed timetable: departure time, meal times, rest periods, arrival hour. When the transport was delayed, he broke down completely, convinced something had gone wrong. The refusal, doctors realized, was not a rejection of rescue. It was a fear of collapse. Some survivors articulated it more clearly than others. A man in his 30s told a British officer, "If I leave, I won't know what to do with my hands." Another said simply, "Here, I know how not to die." These statements baffled those who had not lived inside the camp. But to those who listened closely, a pattern emerged. Life in Bergen-Belsen had trained people not to live, but to endure. Endurance required focus. Freedom demanded imagination. Many survivors had lost that capacity. The British response varied. Some officers pushed harder, convinced that delay would only prolong suffering. Others adopted a slower approach, allowing patients to remain while gently encouraging movement beyond familiar boundaries. Neither approach offered quick success. Those who were forced to leave often deteriorated rapidly. Medical records describe cases of survivors transported to hospitals who refused treatment, tore out feeding tubes, or attempted to return to the camp on foot. This behavior was not interpreted as madness at the time. It was described clinically as disorientation or extreme anxiety. But privately, many staff admitted they were witnessing something unprecedented: a psychological wound that did not respond to relief. The refusals also exposed another truth that liberation could not erase. For many survivors, there was nowhere to go. Entire families had been erased, homes seized or destroyed, national borders had shifted, often violently. Anti-Semitism had not vanished with the SS. For some, returning meant facing hostility, suspicion, or renewed danger. But even those with theoretical destinations hesitated. The idea of home had become abstract. Inside the camp, identity had been reduced to numbers, roles, survival status. Outside, identity required paperwork, nationality, belonging. Things the survivors no longer possessed. When asked where they would go, many answered honestly, "I don't know. There is nothing. I am finished there." The refusal to leave thus became layered. Practical fear intertwined with psychological paralysis. Trauma fused with reality. British authorities faced mounting pressure to resolve the situation. Bergen-Belsen could not remain indefinitely populated. Disease control demanded action. Political optics demanded progress. And yet, forcing survivors into freedom risked becoming another act of violence. This tension defined the early weeks after liberation. Doctors began advocating for gradual exposure rather than removal. Survivors were encouraged to walk short distances beyond their barracks, to sit outside, to engage in simple tasks, to rebuild agency step by step. Some responded, others did not. A subset of survivors remained entirely resistant. These were the individuals later described as the ones who asked to stay. Not all asked verbally. Some communicated through behavior, refusing transport, hiding during evacuation attempts, clinging to camp routines long after they were no longer required. They were not many, statistically, but they haunted those who encountered them. One British nurse wrote that the most disturbing aspect was not their fear, but their calm. They were not hysterical, she noted. They were resigned, as if they had already decided that this was where their life ended. The camp, in these cases, functioned as a psychological anchor, a place where the mind could rest because nothing new was demanded of it. Freedom demanded too much. As weeks passed, the refusals forced a re-evaluation of what liberation meant. It was no longer enough to open gates. It was no longer sufficient to remove guards. Something inside the survivors had been shaped by captivity in ways that could not be undone by announcement. Bergen-Belsen, once designed to break bodies, had also broken internal compasses. The first no, spoken at the gates, was not defiance. It was a confession that survival had come at a cost no one had calculated, and that for some, the war had ended, but life had not yet returned. By late April 1945, British doctors at Bergen-Belsen stopped using the word liberation in their internal notes. They began using medical language instead. What confronted them was no longer a military situation, nor purely a humanitarian one. It was a clinical reality unfolding in real time, without precedent, and without terminology sufficient to describe it. Men and women were alive, technically free, physically rescued, and yet incapable of functioning outside the environment that had nearly killed them. This contradiction forced a shift in perspective. Freedom itself became something to be managed. The first weeks after liberation produced an avalanche of observations. British Army Medical Corps officers, nurses from the Red Cross, and volunteer psychiatrists recorded behaviors they could not categorize under existing diagnostic frameworks. These were not cases of acute psychosis, not hysteria, not simple depression. What they observed was more systematic. Patients who could communicate coherently about the past became mute when asked about the future. Survivors who could recount years of suffering in precise detail were unable to answer basic questions about where they would go next. Asked to choose between two options, hospital or rest camp, relocation now or later, many froze completely. choice triggered collapse. One medical report noted that when survivors were offered alternatives, their pulse rates increased sharply, sometimes doubling within minutes. Sweating, trembling, shallow breathing followed. In several cases, patients lost consciousness. The same individuals responded calmly when given direct instructions with no alternatives presented. This pattern repeated often enough to be unmistakable. Autonomy had become physiologically dangerous. Doctors began testing this unintentionally. When schedules were rigid, fixed mealtimes, assigned tasks, clearly defined expectations, patients stabilized faster. When flexibility was introduced, progress stalled or reversed. The conclusion was deeply unsettling. Years of enforced obedience had not merely suppressed independence, they had replaced it. In Bergen-Belsen, survival had depended on reading authority signals with precision. A delayed response, a misunderstood order, an unnecessary initiative could result in beating, starvation, or death. Over time, the nervous system adapted. Hypervigilance replaced agency. Compliance became reflex. Liberation removed the threat, but not the reflex. British psychiatrists noted that many survivors displayed what would later be recognized as severe institutionalization. But in 1945, this concept was only beginning to form. The doctors were witnessing its rawest manifestation. One officer described patients who waited motionless for instructions that never came. Another wrote of survivors who asked permission before eating food placed directly in front of them. When told no permission was needed, they hesitated, sometimes for hours. A particularly striking observation involved nighttime behavior. Several patients reported increased anxiety after sunset. Without guards, without roll calls, without the sounds that had once marked danger, the night felt unstructured, and therefore unsafe. Some survivors slept better when lights were left on, mimicking the camp's constant illumination. Others requested someone to patrol the barracks, not for protection from violence, but for reassurance that order still existed. Order, not safety, had become the psychological anchor. Doctors also documented an altered relationship to space. Survivors often avoided crossing thresholds. Doorways, gates, and perimeter lines triggered hesitation or distress. Some patients paced within a confined area, repeating the same path over and over, as if mapping reassurance through repetition. When encouraged to walk beyond familiar zones, they became visibly disoriented. Not lost, frightened. Spatial freedom overwhelmed them. The medical staff attempted gradual exposure techniques, though they did not yet call them that. Patients were encouraged to take short walks, accompanied by staff. Some managed this with visible strain. Others refused entirely. A few attempted to flee back into the camp the moment supervision lessened. In one recorded incident, a survivor transferred to a nearby hospital repeatedly attempted to return to Bergen-Belsen, insisting that this is where I am supposed to be. He was not delusional. He understood that the camp was dangerous. He simply could not reconcile himself to existing anywhere else. Another recurring observation concerned time perception. Many survivors had lost the ability to estimate duration. Asked how long something would take, they could not answer. Asked to plan for later in the day, they became anxious or confused. The future had been compressed out of existence during captivity. Life had become a series of immediate threats, with no meaningful beyond. Doctors noted that this made rehabilitation extraordinarily difficult. Recovery required patience, planning, delayed reward, all capacities severely eroded by prolonged trauma. There were also moral dimensions to the problem. British staff struggled with guilt and frustration. How could offering freedom cause suffering? How could rescue feel like harm? Some feared they were replicating coercion under a different name. Others worried that leaving survivors in the camp environment prolonged psychological damage. No option felt clean. The camp itself became an uncomfortable compromise. It was transformed into a displaced persons facility, but its physical resemblance to the former concentration camp remained. Barbed wire was removed gradually, not all at once. Barracks were cleaned, but not demolished. Familiarity was preserved intentionally. This decision was pragmatic, but ethically fraught. Doctors knew that Bergen-Belsen could not be a place of healing forever. But they also knew that immediate rupture could kill patients, already fragile beyond measure. Medical mortality rates after liberation reinforced caution. Many survivors died not from prior injuries, but from complications triggered by change. Refeeding syndrome, infections exacerbated by stress, cardiovascular collapse linked to sudden exertion or emotional shock. Freedom, administered too quickly, proved lethal. As weeks passed, British medical reports began to converge around a grim understanding. The camp had inflicted not only physical starvation, but psychological dependency. The mind had adapted to captivity so completely that freedom itself became destabilizing. This realization marked a turning point. Survivors who refused to leave were no longer seen as ungrateful or irrational. They were recognized as patients, not just of disease, but of an environment engineered to destroy autonomy. One senior physician wrote that the camp had trained obedience as a survival organ. Remove it too abruptly, and the system failed. This reframing altered policy. Rehabilitation programs expanded. Survivors were given roles: cooks, aides, cleaners, not as labor, but as controlled reintroduction to responsibility. Choice was introduced slowly, often framed as suggestion rather than option. "Would you like to eat now?" became, "It is time to eat." The difference mattered. Progress was uneven. Some patients responded. Others remained frozen. A small number never adapted at all. These were the individuals who later haunted the records. The ones who asked to stay, who delayed evacuation repeatedly, who clung to the camp long after its function had changed. Doctors could not force recovery. They could only document it. And what they documented challenged fundamental assumptions about trauma and survival. It revealed that the opposite of captivity was not freedom, but chaos, and that the human mind, pushed far enough, would choose the familiar over the humane. By early summer 1945, Bergen-Belsen stood as a grim lesson. The war had not only destroyed lives, it had reshaped the basic mechanisms by which people understood safety, choice, and selfhood. Liberation exposed that damage, but it could not undo it. For some survivors, the camp had ended. For others, it had simply moved inside. By May 1945, British administrators at Bergen-Belsen understood one thing with absolute clarity: the camp could not simply be erased. It had already rewritten the internal logic of the people who survived it. What they were confronting was not nostalgia for captivity, nor moral confusion. It was something colder and more mechanical. The camp had become an organizing principle, a system that replaced the functions normally performed by society, family, and selfhood. To dismantle it abruptly was to remove the last structure holding certain individuals upright. Institutionalization was not yet a formal diagnosis, but its outlines were unmistakable. Survivors displayed behaviors that mirrored long-term incarceration in other contexts: prisons, asylums, forced labor colonies, but intensified by starvation, terror, and total dependency. Bergen-Belsen had not merely confined bodies. It had supplied a brutal, comprehensive framework for existence. Wake when ordered, move when commanded, eat when allowed, endure without question. Outside that framework, nothing made sense. Doctors observed that many survivors continued to follow camp routines long after they were no longer enforced. They woke before dawn. They lined up without instruction. They waited for inspections that would never come. When none occurred, anxiety increased. Order had been internalized. In the absence of external control, the mind attempted to recreate it. One British nurse described how survivors would instinctively form rows during food distribution, even when told they could approach freely. When allowed to choose seating, they hesitated or stood until assigned a place. Choice, again, functioned as a destabilizer. The camp had removed personal preference so thoroughly that its return felt dangerous. This extended even to bodily awareness. Doctors noted that some patients struggled to identify hunger or fatigue unless prompted by routine. Their internal signals had been overridden for so long that they no longer trusted them. External cues, bells, orders, schedules, had replaced instinct. The result was a population technically alive, but operating on borrowed regulation. This became most apparent when British staff attempted to introduce democratic processes into camp life. Survivor committees were formed to help organize services and represent needs. On paper, this was empowerment. In practice, it exposed deep fractures. Meetings stalled. Votes could not be completed. Survivors deferred endlessly, asking British officers to decide instead. Responsibility provoked anxiety. Authority felt safer than autonomy. One report described a meeting that ended abruptly when participants became overwhelmed by disagreement over minor logistics. The conflict itself, harmless by any normal standard, triggered distress. Years of punishment for dissent had trained them to associate disagreement with danger. Silence, not debate, felt survivable. The camp also shaped moral perception. Under conditions of extreme scarcity, ethical frameworks had collapsed into pragmatism. Survival required actions that would later be judged harshly. Hoarding, trading favors, aligning with internal hierarchies. Liberation did not immediately restore moral clarity. Survivors carried guilt, shame, and unresolved fear into freedom. For some, remaining in Bergen-Belsen offered temporary suspension of judgment. Inside the camp, everyone had endured the same degradation. Outside, they feared scrutiny. From authorities, from neighbors, from societies eager to simplify survival into heroism or weakness. The camp offered anonymity within shared trauma. British psychiatrists noted that some survivors expressed dread at being asked to explain themselves. "Here, no one asks who I was," one man reportedly said. "Outside, they will." Identity itself had become a burden. The camp also provided something deeply paradoxical: predictability in suffering. Suffering outside was uncertain: poverty, homelessness, hostility, displacement. Inside Bergen-Belsen, suffering had been standardized. Its boundaries were known, its dangers anticipated. For traumatized minds, predictability mattered more than comfort. This was not conscious preference. It was neurological adaptation. Prolonged trauma had rewired stress responses. Hyperarousal had become baseline. Calm felt unfamiliar, even threatening. The nervous system, deprived of danger signals, searched for them. In this context, freedom felt eerily wrong. Doctors observed that some survivors became more anxious as physical conditions improved. Weight gain coincided with agitation. Clean clothes triggered discomfort. Silence unnerved them. Recovery disrupted equilibrium. British staff found themselves in a moral paradox. Improving conditions sometimes worsened psychological stability. The camp's physical form reinforced this dynamic. Barbed wire was removed gradually, not because it was needed, but because its sudden absence caused distress. Survivors who had navigated space through boundaries now felt exposed. Boundaries, even oppressive ones, had provided orientation. Without them, space became limitless, and therefore unsafe. Time posed a similar problem. Schedules were essential. When staff experimented with flexible routines, anxiety rose. Fixed times anchored survivors in the present. Without them, hours stretched dangerously. One psychiatrist wrote that time outside the camp felt uncontained. Inside, days had been brutal but finite. Outside, they threatened to dissolve into uncertainty. The camp had compressed existence into manageable units. Freedom expanded it too fast. This is where institutionalization revealed its darkest edge. The longer some survivors remained inside the camp structure, even in its reformed state, the harder it became to leave. What began as stabilization risked becoming entrenchment. Doctors debated this fiercely. Was the camp now a therapeutic environment, or was it perpetuating dependency? The answer varied by individual. Some survivors progressed steadily. They began venturing beyond familiar zones. They accepted transfer. They adapted slowly to autonomy. Others stalled completely. These were the ones whose names appeared repeatedly in reports, not because they caused problems, but because they defied resolution. They were physically capable of leaving, medically stable, cognitively intact. And yet, they stayed. Not out of loyalty, not out of fear of the British, not out of misunderstanding. They stayed because the camp still made sense. British administrators faced mounting pressure to close Bergen-Belsen entirely. Politically, symbolically, the camp was a scar. Leaving people inside it felt wrong. And yet, removing them forcibly echoed the very violence they sought to undo. The ethical tension was acute. Doctors warned that abrupt removal could result in suicide, collapse, or death from stress-related complications. Administrators worried about optics and precedent. Ultimately, compromises were made. Some survivors were relocated gradually. Others were allowed to remain longer under medical supervision. Bergen-Belsen transformed into a displaced persons camp in name and function, but the psychological residue of its past remained embedded in every structure. For the survivors who asked to stay, time did not heal quickly. Their attachment was not to the camp itself, but to the certainty it represented. Outside demanded reinvention. Inside required endurance. Endurance had kept them alive. Freedom demanded something they had not needed in years: faith in an unpredictable future. By the time summer arrived, British reports had grown more sober. The optimism of liberation had faded into realism. Bergen-Belsen was no longer just a site of atrocity. It was a living demonstration of what prolonged captivity did to the human mind. The camp had ended as a killing machine, but it persisted as a psychological structure. For some, leaving it would take longer than the war itself. By early summer, the question was no longer whether people could leave. It was why some chose not to. British administrators had begun categorizing survivors into broad groups: those who required continued medical care, those ready for relocation, those awaiting documentation. And then, there was a smaller, more troubling category: individuals who were medically cleared, physically mobile, psychologically stable enough to function, and yet explicitly requested to remain inside the former camp. Not temporarily, indefinitely. These were not passive refusals. These were deliberate decisions. When asked why, their answers were often calm, measured, and disturbingly rational. "I can be useful here. They need help. I know how this place works." At first, British officers interpreted this as altruism. After all, Bergen-Belsen was overwhelmed. Thousands still required care. Infrastructure was fragile. Experienced hands were valuable, so requests were granted. Survivors were allowed to assist with food distribution, sanitation, medical support, translation. They were not guards. They were not administrators. But they were given roles, defined, structured, predictable. And almost immediately, their condition improved. Doctors observed that survivors who took on responsibilities showed lower anxiety levels. Sleep improved. Appetite stabilized. Emotional regulation increased. The act of being needed, within familiar boundaries, restored a sense of purpose that abstract freedom could not. This reinforced a dangerous idea. Perhaps staying was helping them heal. Perhaps the camp, restructured and stripped of violence, could function as a transitional environment. Perhaps leaving too soon was the real harm. The problem was not what this choice did in the short term. It was what it did over time. Survivors who stayed on as helpers began to organize their lives around the camp's rhythms. They woke early. They followed schedules. They reported to supervisors. They received rations at set times. Their days regained shape. Outside, displaced persons camps struggled with overcrowding, scarcity, and bureaucratic confusion. News filtered back of chaos, hunger, hostility. Compared to that, Bergen-Belsen, paradoxically, felt stable. Some survivors who had initially left attempted to return. British records note multiple cases of individuals requesting reassignment back to Bergen-Belsen after experiencing disorientation or panic elsewhere. Not all requests were granted, but enough were to raise concern. The camp was no longer just a place people hesitated to leave. It was becoming a place people wanted to come back to. This alarmed medical staff. The longer survivors remained in the camp environment, even in its reformed state, the more entrenched their dependency became. Familiarity bred psychological gravity. What had begun as stabilization risked turning into permanent attachment. Doctors debated this openly. One camp physician warned that the re-establishment of routine within the same physical structures risks reinforcing the very conditioning we seek to undo. Another countered that removing structure prematurely caused collapse. There was no clear solution. British administrators found themselves balancing competing ethical imperatives: do no harm, restore autonomy, prevent dependency, ensure survival. Each goal undermined the others. Those who stayed often justified their decision pragmatically. They pointed out that the camp provided food, shelter, and work. That outside, anti-Semitism had not vanished. That returning home was impossible for many. That the world beyond the gates was hostile and unpredictable. They were not wrong. What troubled doctors was not the logic of the decision, but the emotional flatness with which it was made. These survivors did not express hope or attachment. They expressed resignation. Staying was not a preference. It was the least threatening option. In private notes, psychiatrists described a phenomenon they struggled to articulate: a narrowing of possibility. Survivors no longer imagined multiple futures. They selected from the limited options immediately available. The camp, already known, outweighed the risk of the unknown. This was not laziness. It was not cowardice. It was adaptive pessimism. The war had taught them that expectation invited disappointment, and hope invited punishment. So they chose certainty over promise. The British administration attempted to counteract this by introducing gradual disengagement. Survivors working in the camp were encouraged to take days off outside the perimeter, to visit nearby towns under supervision, to interact with civilians. The results were mixed. Some adapted. Others experienced severe distress. A few returned shaken, reporting hostility or indifference from locals. These experiences reinforced the belief that the camp, however grim its history, was safer than the world beyond it. For survivors who had lost families, the camp also offered community. Not intimacy, but proximity. Shared suffering created bonds that did not require explanation. Outside, their experiences marked them as different, sometimes unwelcome. Inside, difference was the norm. British officers noted that survivors who stayed often referred to the camp in neutral, almost domestic terms. My barrack. Our kitchen. This place. Language softened without ever becoming affectionate. No one called it home, but no one named an alternative either. Over time, the distinction between helping and belonging blurred. Survivors who stayed became fixtures. New arrivals deferred to them. Staff relied on them. Their identity fused with the place. This created a second dilemma. Removing these individuals later would be harder than doing so earlier. Doctors warned that extended exposure risked crystallizing institutionalization. Administrators worried about precedent. If some stayed indefinitely, what message did that send about liberation? The question became unavoidable. When does care become captivity? British policy shifted again. Deadlines were introduced, gently, bureaucratically. Survivors were informed that Bergen-Belsen would not remain open forever. That relocation was inevitable. Reactions varied. Some accepted the news with resignation. Others reacted with visible distress. A few became angry, not at the British, but at the idea of change itself. Doctors observed regression in some long-term residents when departure became imminent. Sleep disturbances returned. Appetite declined. Anxiety spiked. The camp, once a scaffold for recovery, had become a psychological crutch. The realization was painful but clear. Staying had helped and harmed. It had preserved life. It had delayed living. For the survivors who chose to stay, the camp was not a symbol of oppression anymore. It was a controlled environment in a world that had proven uncontrollable. Leaving meant confronting loss without the buffer of routine. By late summer 1945, British administrators began preparing the final phase: closure, relocation, transition. For many, this was simply logistics. For others, it was a second liberation and a second trauma. The people who asked to stay had not misunderstood freedom. They understood it too well. They knew that freedom did not guarantee safety, dignity, or belonging. It only removed the fence. And for those who had learned to survive within limits, limitless space was terrifying. The camp had taught them how to endure. The world beyond demanded something else entirely. By late 1945, Bergen-Belsen no longer resembled the camp the British had entered in April. The mass graves had been sealed. The worst of the disease outbreaks had been contained. Barracks were cleaner, administration more stable. Many survivors had been relocated to displaced persons camps or reunited, where possible, with surviving relatives. And yet, a residual population remained. They were not the weakest, not the sickest, not the most visibly traumatized. They were the ones who did not move. British records began referring to them obliquely, not as a category, but as a problem without a name. Long-term residents, delayed transfers, unresolved cases. Behind the bureaucratic language were individuals who had survived everything the camp had thrown at them, and then failed to survive what came after. Doctors noticed a troubling pattern. The longer survivors remained within the camp environment, even in its transformed state, the less capable they became of imagining departure. What had initially been caution hardened into immobility. What had been fear became resignation. These were not dramatic cases. There were no breakdowns at the gate, no public refusals. Instead, there was postponement, endless delay. Next week, when winter passes, after this task is finished. Departure was always deferred. Psychiatrists began documenting what they described as emotional flattening. Survivors spoke calmly about their lives, their losses, their future, or lack thereof. Affect was muted, joy absent, despair subdued rather than acute. This emotional neutrality was deceptive. It masked profound exhaustion. Years of hypervigilance had drained emotional reserves. When the immediate threat was removed, there was nothing left to mobilize. The mind, having endured too much, simply stopped projecting forward. One physician described it as a life preserved in form, but no longer animated by expectation. These survivors were not suicidal. They did not express a wish to die, but neither did they express a wish to live elsewhere. Survival had become maintenance rather than movement. In modern terms, this might be described as complex trauma with depressive features. In 1945, doctors struggled to articulate it without pathologizing what was clearly an understandable response to extreme conditions. They began using phrases that skirted diagnosis: psychological inertia, arrested development, loss of forward impulse. One phrase appeared more than once in private notes, though rarely in official reports. Psychological death. It did not mean insanity. It did not mean loss of reason. It meant something quieter and more irreversible. The collapse of the inner mechanisms that drive adaptation, desire, and change. These individuals could function. They could speak. They could work. They could obey. But they could not reorient themselves toward a future that required risk. Risk, after all, had nearly killed them. Doctors observed that survivors who remained longest often had the fewest external ties. Entire families lost, communities erased, national identities complicated or dangerous. For them, leaving the camp did not mean returning to life. It meant entering a vacuum. Inside the camp, even stripped of its former terror, existence was framed. Outside, it was undefined. One survivor reportedly told a British doctor, "Out there, I am nobody. Here, at least, I exist." This was not self-pity. It was assessment. The British administration faced increasing pressure to close the chapter. Politically and morally, the continued existence of Bergen-Belsen was intolerable. It symbolized atrocity. Its ongoing use, however transformed, unsettled observers. But the remaining residents complicated every timetable. Forcible relocation was considered and rejected. The memory of deportations was too fresh. Compulsion risked re-traumatization on a scale that no one was prepared to justify. So compromise prevailed. Some survivors were relocated in stages. Others were transferred with companions to reduce isolation. A few were allowed to remain longer under supervision, their cases reviewed repeatedly without resolution. Time passed. Winter came. And still, some did not leave. Medical staff noticed that prolonged residence correlated with a peculiar form of stagnation. Physical health stabilized, but psychological recovery plateaued. The camp environment, once a buffer, became a ceiling. Progress halted. Doctors worried that what had begun as protection was now entrenching damage. And yet, alternatives remained bleak. Displaced persons, camps elsewhere were overcrowded. Bureaucracy was slow. Anti-Semitism persisted. Survivors encountered suspicion, fatigue, indifference. Many felt that the world had moved on without them. Returning to society required not only strength, but trust. In institutions, in neighbors, in the future. Trust had been systematically destroyed. The remaining residents of Bergen-Belsen did not lack courage. They lacked belief. Belief that effort would be rewarded. Belief that attachment would not end in loss. Belief that stability could exist without coercion. Doctors could not prescribe belief. They could only observe its absence. By early 1946, the camp was finally dismantled. Survivors were relocated. Bergen-Belsen ceased to function as a living place. Its physical structures were erased. The ground was reclaimed for memorialization. But for those who had stayed the longest, the camp did not end with demolition. British follow-up reports tracked some of them. Many struggled elsewhere. Chronic depression, social withdrawal, difficulty maintaining employment or relationships, a persistent sense of displacement. They were free. But freedom did not restore what captivity had taken. One psychiatrist reflected later that the camp had achieved something its designers never articulated openly. It had trained people not merely to obey, but to survive without expectation. Liberation returned choice, but not the capacity to use it. This was the quietest victory of the system, not the bodies it destroyed, but the futures it erased. The survivors who asked to stay were not anomalies. They were the logical outcome of prolonged dehumanization. They did not misunderstand freedom. They understood its cost. Leaving required faith that life could be more than endurance. For some, that faith had died long before the gates opened. The war ended in 1945. For them, it ended somewhere inside and did not restart. By the time Bergen-Belsen was dismantled, There was nothing left to liberate. The barbed wire was gone. The watchtowers were empty. The barracks were cleared, disinfected, erased from use, and then from existence. The camp ceased to function as a place, but its effects did not. British records closed the file with administrative language, dates, transfers, numbers. The remaining survivors were relocated. The site was handed over for memorialization. Officially, the story ended. Unofficially, it did not. For years afterward, doctors would recall a moment that never made it into reports. A moment without drama, without witnesses, without ceremony. An open gate. No guards. No orders. No one stopping you. And still, hesitation. Some survivors, even when finally relocated, stood at exits, hospital doors, camp perimeters, transport platforms, and did not move immediately. Not because they were stopped, but because movement itself had become unfamiliar. Freedom required momentum. They had learned endurance instead. The war had taught them how to exist inside limits. It had not taught them how to live beyond them. Bergen-Belsen was built to destroy bodies. It succeeded often enough. But its most enduring damage was quieter. It dismantled the internal mechanisms that make choice possible. It taught people that safety comes from obedience, that initiative invites danger, that the future is a liability. Liberation removed the fence. It did not restore the future. The prisoners who asked to stay were not clinging to captivity. They were clinging to the last structure their minds could tolerate. Outside the camp, everything required faith. In people, in institutions, in time itself. Faith had been punished too often. So some remained. Not because they wanted the camp, but because they no longer trusted the world. When historians count the dead, these people do not appear. When liberation is celebrated, they are not shown. They survived, and then disappeared into silence. Their story resists heroism. It forces an uncomfortable truth. Freedom is not a moment. It is a skill. And after long enough inside a system designed to erase humanity, that skill does not return automatically when the gates open. Bergen-Belsen ended in 1945. For some of those who lived through it, something else had already ended long before. And no army in the world knew how to liberate that.